5 words ended a scientist's career, and they were scientifically correct. There's a sentence in biology that is scientifically true and socially explosive. It is just 5 words, and saying them out loud got a Harvard scientist pushed out of her job. Those 5 words were, "Sex is biological, not social." She said them calmly, like a teacher explaining gravity, and instantly stepped into a cultural thunderstorm. Not because the science changed, but because the meaning changed. Because we now live in a world where a statement can be biologically accurate and socially forbidden at the same time. This episode is not about taking sides. We are not debating identity. This is about what happens when scientific language enters a world that is no longer listening for facts, only for signals. We are asking a much bigger question. How did a basic fact about human biology become one of the most controversial statements of our time? Welcome to the collision zone of science and society. And welcome back to Smart AF, the show where we cut through the noise and give you the facts straight up. All right, let us start with the science, the part that should be the least controversial but somehow became the most dramatic. In biology, the word sex has a very specific meaning. It is not about identity, personality, behavior, or clothing. It is not about who you are as a person. It is literally about one thing: reproduction. Across humans and almost every animal species on Earth, there are 2 reproductive strategies. One produces large gametes, also called eggs. The other produces small gametes, also called sperm. And that is it. That is the scientific definition of sex: egg producer and sperm producer. Female and male. It is the same system in mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, insects, and even plants. This is not new. It is not political. It is not a moral category. It is simply evolutionary housekeeping. Now, people often jump in and say, but what about intersex variations? And yes, they exist. Biology has natural variation everywhere. But intersex conditions do not create new sexes. They are natural variations within the two-sex system, just as genetic variations exist within height, skin tone, or metabolism. The truth is this: having biological categories does not erase anyone's humanity. Biological sex describes how our species reproduces. Nothing more, nothing less. Now that we understand what biological sex means, here is where everything becomes complicated. Because the conversation that scientists are having is not the conversation that society is having. When a biologist says there are 2 sexes, they are talking about reproductive categories: eggs and sperm, a description of how humans and most animals reproduce. But when many people hear that same sentence, they are not hearing biology. They are hearing identity. For many people, the word gender is not a scientific term. It is a lived experience. It is the way they express themselves, the way they relate to the world, and the way they understand who they are. This is why we need to separate these 2 conversations instead of stacking them on top of each other like unstable Jenga pieces. Sex is a biological category. Gender is a social and personal experience. Both are real, but they are not the same thing. This matters because when someone says there are more than 2 genders, they are not making a biological claim. They are describing the diversity of human identity and expression. And when someone says there are 2 sexes, they are not making a comment about anyone's identity. They are describing the reproductive structure of our species. The problem is that these 2 conversations keep crashing into each other. A biological definition gets interpreted as a political statement. A scientific term gets misunderstood as a moral judgment. A description gets heard as an exclusion. And in that confusion, people get hurt. Scientists get silenced. Transgender people feel invalidated. Everyone ends up arguing past one another. So before we go any further, here is one thing I want to make absolutely clear. Acknowledging how biology works does not erase anyone's identity. And acknowledging someone's identity does not erase biology. These 2 things can exist at the same time. Science describes reproductive structures and functions. Society describes people. Now let us talk about the real-world example that exposed just how deep this confusion goes: the Carole Hooven case. Carole Hooven is a Harvard-trained evolutionary biologist who spent her entire career studying hormones, sex differences, and human behavior. This is literally her field. This is what she teaches, researches, and writes about. During an interview at Fox News in 2021, she explained the standard scientific definition of sex. Female is the reproductive class that produces large gametes, and male is the reproductive class that produces small gametes. That is it. A basic biological explanation. Here is what she said on Fox News. The facts are that there are in fact 2 sexes. There are male and female. And those sexes are designated by the kinds of gametes we produce. Then she added something very important. The ideology seems to be that biology really is not as important as how somebody feels about themselves or feels their sex to be. But we can treat people with respect and respect their gender identities and use their preferred pronouns. So, understanding the facts about biology does not prevent us from treating people with respect. But the reaction was immediate and intense. She was accused of being insensitive, harmful, and even transphobic. Not because her science was wrong, but because people heard it as a commentary on identity. Her own academic department distanced itself from her. Colleagues criticized her publicly. She faced enormous pressure and eventually resigned from her teaching position. This is the heart of the problem. Hooven was having a scientific conversation. The public was having an identity conversation. And instead of separating the two, people assumed they were the same debate. To many listeners, her statement sounded like, "Your identity is not valid." But that is not what she said. She was describing reproductive biology, not denying anyone's experience. The tragedy is that nobody won. A scientist felt silenced. Transgender students felt threatened. And the actual conversation that needed to happen, the one about science and identity coexisting, got lost entirely. This is what happens when society responds to scientific terms as if they are moral judgments. The meaning of the word shifts, the intentions get misunderstood, and suddenly the conversation is no longer about truth. It is about fear. So how do we get to a point where explaining basic reproductive biology can trigger outrage, fear, and accusations? Part of it is that science and society speak completely different languages. Science is descriptive. It tells us how nature works. It uses categories to create clarity. Male and female are reproductive categories, not value judgments. But society does not hear descriptions. Society hears meaning. For many people, gender is not a biological category. It is an identity. It is connection. It is safety. So when they hear a scientist talk about sex categories, it feels personal, even when the scientist is not talking about identity at all. And on the other side, scientists often underestimate how emotionally charged these topics are. They assume people will hear the words in a neutral, academic way. But that is not how human psychology works. This is how the wires get crossed. Science describes reproductive biology. Society describes people. And when those two conversations overlap without context, everything becomes confused. Another reason this became so tense is that we live in a moment where language carries enormous political weight. People worry that certain words, even when used scientifically, will be weaponized in social debates. So instead of asking, what does this term mean in biology? People jump straight to, who will this harm? Or what side are you on? The scientific definition gets lost and the emotional reaction takes over. This is why conversations about sex and gender feel so fragile. It is not because the science is unclear. It is because the meaning of the words has shifted depending on who is speaking and who is listening. And when science and society operate with different definitions but use the same words, conflict becomes almost unavoidable. The goal is not to choose one over the other. The goal is to understand both. Science gives us clarity about reproductive biology. Society gives us insight into human experience. And neither truth needs to erase the other. Before we go any further, I want to talk about inclusive language, because this is where many arguments start and where most misunderstandings live. You may have heard people say pregnant women, and you may have also heard people say pregnant people. To some, that sounds political. To others, it sounds respectful. So what is actually going on here? The same thing happens with the words breastfeeding and chest feeding. Some individuals, especially transgender men and non-binary people, prefer the term chest feeding because it feels more aligned with their identity. For them, the traditional language feels uncomfortable or dysphoric. So inclusive language can help create a sense of safety and recognition. But again, the biology itself does not change. Lactation is a function of the female reproductive system involving mammary glands, hormones, and the same physiological pathways that exist across mammals. Now, here is something important. There are rare cases where individuals with male reproductive systems have been able to produce milk under specific medical or hormonal conditions. These cases exist, but they are unusual and typically involve complex hormonal interventions or medical circumstances. They do not represent the typical biological pathway of lactation, and they do not change the fact that natural postpartum milk production is a function of female reproductive anatomy. Inclusive language can describe someone's experience, but it does not alter the underlying biology of how milk is produced. Inclusive language is about acknowledging that not everyone who becomes pregnant identifies as a woman. Some transgender men and some non-binary people can become pregnant if they have a functioning female reproductive system. So using a phrase like pregnant people can be an act of respect. It tells someone, I see you, I hear you, and I am not reducing you to a category you do not identify with. But here's the important part. Inclusive language does not change biological reality. It simply changes how we speak to one another. The biological fact remains very clear. Only individuals with female reproductive anatomy can become pregnant. That includes anyone with ovaries, a uterus, and the hormonal environment needed to sustain pregnancy. A transgender woman cannot become pregnant because she does not have ovaries or a uterus. A transgender man can become pregnant if he retains those organs. These truths are not political. They are simply physiology. So the real goal is not to choose between inclusive language and scientific accuracy. The goal is to hold both at the same time. We can absolutely use inclusive language when speaking to or about individuals who identify outside the traditional categories. That is respect. And we can absolutely teach, discuss, and understand the biological pathways of pregnancy as a function of female reproductive systems. That is science. Respect does not erase biology. Biology does not erase identity. The problem only begins when we pretend one must replace the other. Inclusive language is for people. Biological language is for physiology. Both matter, and neither has to cancel the other. Now let us talk about why this conversation feels so tense, especially inside universities, medical schools, newsrooms, and public institutions. Institutions are terrified of causing harm. They are terrified of being seen as discriminatory. They are terrified of upsetting already marginalized groups. So instead of creating clarity, many institutions overcorrect into confusion. When a scientific term is considered insensitive, institutions do not explain it better. They avoid it. They soften it. They replace it with vague language in order to seem safer. But avoiding scientific language does not make the biology disappear. It only makes everyone more anxious to talk about it. Here's the problem. Scientists need precise language to describe the body. Society needs compassionate language to describe identity. Institutions do not know how to hold both truths at the same time, so they swing wildly between them. One group feels erased if the science is not stated clearly. Another group feels erased if identity is not respected. Institutions attempt to minimize conflict by pleasing everyone. And in the process, they please no one. This is why conversations about sex and gender become hostile so quickly. People assume that every word carries judgment. People assume they are being invalidated, even when the speaker is simply describing anatomy. And institutions, instead of explaining the difference between science and identity, often blur the line even further. The result is a culture where scientists fear being punished for describing biology, and transgender or non-binary people fear being dismissed or erased. Both fears are real. Both deserve respect. But neither fear should make honest, fact-based conversation impossible. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a very simple, very human truth. Science and society are talking about different things. Science describes reproductive systems. Society describes lived experience. When we confuse the two, conversations explode. When we separate them, everything becomes clearer. We can acknowledge biological sex without devaluing identity. We can use inclusive language without denying physiology. We can respect people without rewriting science. These truths are not enemies. They are partners. The real challenge is slowing down long enough to hear what someone is actually saying. Is this person describing a body or describing an identity? Two different conversations, two different truths. And the moment we recognize that, this entire debate becomes far less threatening, far less hostile, and far more human. That is it for today's episode of Smart AF. And remember, making informed decisions is your right. So before you believe the hype, get Smart AF. See you soon. Thanks for listening. Do you know someone that can use this info? Please share this video with them. If you found this interesting, a thumbs up and subscribe would be awesome. And tap that bell so you never miss an update.